Hi, I'm Nicholas Sperling. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about my Delica build. I built a van, camperized it, and did a whole bunch of other work on it in order to take it on a 5-month road trip around North America back in 2012. So I'm going to be going through everything that I did on the van. If you're a van lifer, this might be for you. And I'll talk a little bit about the actual trip that I did in another video, but for now I'm just going to be focusing on the actual van build. It started back in 2010 when I bought my van. I'd just come back from a trip to Europe and I needed a vehicle, so I was looking at Delicas. They were something I was really interested in. I'd always liked the old Volkswagen vans, the flat front van, but they weren't particularly reliable, and so I was looking for basically a Japanese version of that I could build out. And I bought the van for $4,000. It was in kind of rough shape and it just required a lot of work. So I spent the next year and a half working on it in every free moment that I had until I was able to get this van that I was extremely proud of. And I want to take you through that journey. So we're going to begin with a slideshow and I'm going to do some voiceover talking about all of the different components. The first image here is of me picking up the van. This is the night that I brought it home. The first project I had to work on was for something called wet foot syndrome, and that is behind the headlights in the van. There's a seam between the metal that is sealed with kind of a caulking of sorts, and it tends to break down after about 15 to 20 years. So I had to pull the headlights off and fix that. The next project was repairing all of the bushings. I had sway bar bushings that had gone, so there was a big clunking from the front end whenever I was driving, and so I had to replace those. Next was blanking off the EGR valve. This was something that I didn't particularly want to do. The EGR is in there to recycle exhaust gases from what I understand. I'm not a mechanic, but it was meant to reduce emissions. Unfortunately, it had become extremely clogged. It was actually making the emissions much worse. So at the time we had a program in British Columbia called Air Care, where you have to take your vehicle in, get it checked, and they look at mostly carbon emissions. And I think in Japan they're more concerned about nitrous oxide emissions. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the EGR valve was something that had been installed in Japan to help with emissions, and it just wasn't working for air care standards, and so I actually had to remove it in order to pass the emissions tests. And a nice side effect of that was it also gave the van a lot more power to not have those exhaust gases being pushed back through the engine again. After that, I had some issues with the batteries. I ended up being stranded in a mall parking lot needing to get a jump start and went right off and bought some new batteries from Costco to replace them. It has 2 batteries in it. That is really helpful with camping because it means you have a lot more power to pull from if you're running lights and things like that. This is when I started to get into more of the actual modifications on the vehicle. I got a roof rack, I got some roof boxes, and this was a whole setup to store all of my things while I was driving around so that I didn't have too much clutter inside the vehicle where I was actually having to live. Next was to install some curtains, and this was to give myself some privacy because I was sleeping on the side of the road a lot. I was sleeping in Walmart parking lots, things like that to try to save money, and I didn't want people looking into the van and seeing what I was up to. I also didn't want people looking into the van and seeing that I had maybe some expensive things that were in there. Not that I kept expensive things in there very often. Then I decided to replace the steering wheel. It was a little bit beat up and I was going for sort of a red and black theme, so I went with a Momo style steering wheel. Following that, I bought a lift kit for the van, installed that. It was basically just to get an extra 2 inches. I wasn't looking to make this into some kind of monster vehicle, but I was taking it on some off-road trips. And I also just wanted to take it on some logging roads and get the differentials above the ground a little bit more. So I ended up installing that lift kit, and then I was driving a work truck at the time that needed some new tires. I just bought new tires for the van when I got it, and I wanted to get those bigger tires on the van without having to spend too much money, so I worked out a deal with my boss at the time where I gave him the tires. He paid me a little bit of money for them, and then the rims we just did a direct swap on, so I ended up with the rims that I needed to put some larger tires on. Then I had to repair an issue with rust on the roof, and with the 5 sunroofs that come on the model of Delica that I had, there are some rust issues. It was part of the reason I was able to get the van for only $4,000 when they were selling for about $8,000 at the time. And I decided to do the work myself because it was going to cost about $2,000 to bring it into a shop. I didn't have a lot of money, so I spent a lot of time painting it with hippo liner. And before painting it with hippo liner, I ended up having to sand everything down, Bondo the holes. I rust-proofed the inside of the van as well, just to try to prevent any kind of condensation from getting in there and rusting it out again. I also took that opportunity to paint my mirrors with hippo liner as well, and that was because they were chrome, but they were rusting and they just didn't look all that nice, and I'm not a big fan of chrome anyway. I also went on a project of replacing all of my lights with LED lights. So I changed out the rear tail lights, I changed out all of the interior lights, basically everything except the headlights, because at the time you couldn't buy legal LED headlights. The rims that had come off of this truck that were the right size were pretty rough looking, so I wanted them just to look a little bit nicer. I stuck with that red and black theme that I was going for and painted them with a glossy red and a matte black finish, although it wasn't the most durable finish, so I did have to be careful when I was washing them. This is a picture of the van when I had it detailed and I had a lot of the exterior modifications that I was putting on it done. Then it was time to replace the floor on the inside. I was camperizing the whole thing. I wanted there to be a little bit of insulation. I wanted a flat platform to build on. So I ripped out the old carpet and put in some OSB. I don't generally recommend OSB. I would typically use plywood because it doesn't swell as much when it gets wet. But in this case, I was just trying to be cheap, and so I went with OSB and put some rubber flooring on top of it that I was able to get for free from a flooring shop. These were just odds and ends that they had kicking around. If it wasn't for the fact that I got it for free, I would have stuck with the red and black theme and gone with maybe a more neutral floor, or maybe a red and black speckled floor, something along those lines. Then I had a 3-prong hitch installed, and this is because I wanted the ability to pull a trailer, have a bike rack on it, and have a folding wheel carrier on the other side. So I wanted to utilize all of those 3 hitches. You can see here the bike rack on the back. I also had a bit of a conundrum because I had to cut the side steps for the vehicle in order to fit the bigger tires on it and do some trimming of the wheel wells. But at the same time, there was the transmission cooler, air conditioning, and oil cooling units that were underneath the vehicle. I think those were the 3 items that were sticking down, and I needed to protect them from off-roading and being knocked around because that was sort of a weak point in the vehicle. I had 2 options. I could either raise them up inside the vehicle, which was going to be quite challenging to do and potentially expensive. So instead, I took the steps, I cut them off. They don't act as very much protection in the sense that if you hit a rock, they're just going to bend, but it would act as a warning sign if I was getting close to hitting them. So if there was a rock, I could hear them scraping against the rock and know that maybe I had to back off and find a different route. I found out that my grandfather's old Ford Taurus roof racks fit on my roof basket that was on the back of the van, and I used those to secure my jerry can, so when I was doing longer off-roading trips or going on longer drives on my road trip, I was going to be able to have fuel with me the entire time and not risk breaking down on the side of the road or in the backcountry. Then I installed a skid plate, and again, this is all just about protecting the inside. In this case, there was a vent that directed air up towards the radiator, but it wasn't covered by anything, so you could get sticks or any kind of object stuck up in there and puncture the radiator. That wasn't something I wanted to happen, so I ended up designing my own skid plate in AutoCAD, took it to a metal shop and had them cut and bend it for me, and then I installed some shackles down below as well so that I could be towed out of difficult situations. Then I installed some lights on the front. I had 2 spotlights and 2 fog lights that were controlled from inside the vehicle. I also installed a sound system with a 1400 watt amplifier and 2 15-inch subwoofers, so the van could really bump if I was wanting to sing along on my commute, or I had a lot of people in the back and we just wanted to jam to some music. One thing I had to be careful of when I was installing the sound system was that the front seats have to lift up in order to access the engine because the engine is underneath the driver's side seat. So I had to put the 2 subwoofers and the amp on a bulkhead that hinged out on a piano hinge so that I could hinge it back in order to flip the seats backwards. I also installed a relatively cheap system in the vehicle that was able to remotely unlock the doors. There was also an alarm on the vehicle. I could start it remotely if it was a cold day and I wanted to warm the vehicle up. I think there were some other features on there, but I can't remember off the top of my head what they were. Then I put in a center console. The existing center console just was really low and it was uncomfortable to sit with, and it also had very shallow cup holders. I guess drinks in Japan are a lot smaller than drinks in North America. This is the project on the van that I'm least proud of, and that's because I built it out of OSB, painted it black. It just looked sort of cheap, and the switches that I put in it, I installed with Gorilla Glue, and I should have known better than that, but I hadn't used Gorilla Glue until then, and it just foamed up so much that the foam got all over the switches. They never quite functioned properly after that, and they had all these grooves in them that I got glue in and could never really get out. Then I installed a pyrometer, and that measures your exhaust gas temperatures. The reason for this is that the head on the Delica is aluminum and the block is cast iron, I believe, which means that they're expanding at different rates, and if you heat the engine up too quickly, you risk the block cracking, and that was a pretty common problem on Delicas. And this one in particular had not very much power, and I was planning on taking it through the US during the summer, so there were going to be some very hot days. And I just didn't want to have a $4,000 repair on my hands for a cracked head. Then I got a K&N air filter. These ones are nice because you don't have to keep replacing them on a regular basis. You basically just have to take them out, blow them off, and re-oil them from time to time. Then I got a solenoid to disconnect the two batteries and place them on a switch. The reason I did that was because I wanted to be able to camp with one battery and have that battery being used to recharge my phone and run lights. Basically anything that I would need to do while I'm camping could operate off of one battery, and then I could flick it over to the second battery to start the vehicle and then flick it to run on both batteries once the vehicle was on so that it would recharge both of them with the alternator. Then I installed a couch which folded over to be the platform for the bed, and I put sliders on there. The sliders, one of them came out and acted kind of like a coffee table when you're sitting in the van, and then the other one would slide out when the couch had been folded down into the bed platform position. It would slide out of the sliding door and be a table that you could use for putting your stove on when you're cooking food. Then I managed to find a dual bypass oil filter system from AMSOIL from someone else who had a Delica, and I can't remember exactly why they were getting rid of it, but I was able to get that off of them. I just ordered some new filters and oil from AMSOIL, and I was able to convert my van so that I didn't need oil changes every 5,000 kilometers. I needed them every 20,000, and that really helped me when I was on my road trip because I didn't have to constantly stop and get oil changes. I bolted that in myself and hooked up all the hoses. I had to install it down by the back wheels, which actually ended up being a good thing. It meant it required a little bit more oil, but because of the longer distance that the oil was traveling, it cooled it down quite nicely. Then I bought a memory foam topper, which I was planning on just rolling out. I wanted to have a queen size bed in the back of the van, and that just barely fit between the bulkhead with all of the sound equipment to the back of the van, and then side to side it pretty much filled up everything. Then I had a transmission cooler, and again this is because I was going to some hotter places in the US. I wanted to have a transmission cooler that wasn't just air cooled but also had a fan on it so that it was able to cool that way as well. And I tried to install it a little higher up as well, so like I was mentioning before, I didn't have it hitting any rocks or anything like that when I was off-roading. Then I bought an oil catch can. There's a blow-by tube that would just squirt out oil all over the engine. It was dirty, it wasn't very environmentally friendly, so I decided to put a catch can on the vehicle, and that just caught all of that blow-by. And I cut a hole in the side of my van. This was a nerve-wracking process. I got very nervous, but I did have to cut a hole in the side here in order to put in a plug. This allowed me to pull in at, say, an RV campsite, plug in, and then I had an outlet on the inside of the van that I was able to get power from. So these switches are for the fog lights, the rear lights, the spotlights, and then I have a switch for the glow plugs as well because my ECU failed on me and I needed to hook it up manually. And also I wanted it to be manual instead of getting another ECU because I was able to give it a little bit more warmth if I was starting it up on a really cold day. Then I got some mud flaps because when you've got some bigger tires on your vehicle, you need to make sure that they are covered so that you're not throwing rocks back at the people behind you. That's just a legal requirement. And I installed them with some aircraft cable because they wanted to hang down and hit the wheels. These are the rear lights that hooked up to those switches that I had installed earlier. They're 1200 lumens each, so if I was at a campsite, I was able to flick them on, not drain too much power because they're LED, and just light up my entire campsite if I wanted to set up a tent in the dark or do anything else. Then I put in a new exhaust system with a stainless steel tip on it. This was because my old system had rattled itself apart and I wanted to shorten the distance, send it out the side, because I was planning on installing a waste vegetable oil system in the vehicle. I never ended up getting to that, but the idea was that not having the exhaust running out the back meant I had more space back there once I got rid of the spare tire to install an extra tank for the waste vegetable oil. I put in a small inverter, and you can see a 12-volt outlet there that runs directly to the battery so that you don't have a long thin wire that potentially can melt. So these were for running laptops and phones and whatever else I wanted to use back there. Now here are some pictures of what the vehicle looked like once it was finished to some degree on the inside. I'd kind of accomplished the really big goals that I wanted to get to. And you can see these custom red cushions that I've installed, the curtains across the front, across the side. I had some red window tint left over from my previous vehicle, and I just decided to make some spotted windows. Just kind of a fun project. There wasn't really any purpose to it. I also installed a brake controller. This is when I got back from my road trip in 2012. This was so that I could tow a trailer that I also bought. Actually, the day that I came back from my trip, I bought this trailer because my plan was to arrive home and immediately start running my own construction business. And then I got some decals put on the side for my company. This is an image of the back of my van after I came back from my road trip. I tried to get a sticker at all of these memorable places that I visited, and I covered my back windows with them. And this is an image of the route that I took around North America. It was 56,000 kilometers. It took me 5 months. And I will discuss this in another video. I'd like to go over maybe some funny stories from the trip or just an overview of the trip as a whole, because that was a pretty monumental time in my life. Unfortunately, in 2014, my van was totaled by a drunk driver. I was coming home from a Pride event and I was in really good spirits. I was just a block away from home and a drunk driver ran a stop sign, hit the side of my vehicle. The vehicle flipped over on its side. I ended up tearing the meniscus in my knee, dislocating one of my shoulders, and luckily it was right outside of a police station, so police were able to come out, open the door for me, pulled me out as fuel was leaking everywhere, and I spent that evening and the weeks following in complete shock. I'd put so much time and effort into building this van. It was extremely sad to see it go, but I have a new van now that I'm really excited to be working on. I bought a Toyota Hiace, kind of similar to the Delica in appearance, less about four-wheel driving, but I can have my queen-size bed in the front and I can have some tool shelving in the back. It's about 3 feet longer than the Delica, and so that's a project that I'm really excited about and that I'm going to be sharing with you hopefully soon, although it's going to take me a while to build it out. So this is the story of my Delica. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the build. I know if you're not mechanically inclined, this might not be extremely interesting for you, but if you're interested in living out of a vehicle, I did it for 5 months. I never got tired of it. I could have kept going for many, many more months. And it was also a really fun build. I do a lot of construction work. I love learning about mechanics. And if you're interested, I would just say go for it. There are plenty of YouTube videos that you can follow if you're not quite sure what you're doing. And that was how I approached everything. If I had to replace my alternator, which I did, I just looked it up on YouTube and figured it out. So it's not as difficult as you might think, and it's a really rewarding experience. And that's about it. So if you enjoyed this, please give the video a like. If you have ideas for future videos, you have comments or questions, please leave them down below. And if you want to see more content of mine, please hit that subscribe button. Until next time, have a great day.